Last three meetings we actually have been talking about placement. Uh, I'm not sure if we have a clear resolution for the same in terms of the API. I tried to update something as something which can have us move forward. As an example, in the agenda notes, I'll just share that. And if people have already read it, then they can shoot it down or tell the flaws or problems with it, or we can talk about it. Otherwise, I can just briefly talk about it.
I think that's kind of similar to my thinking. I
Okay.
don't know that there's a point in having a cluster placement thing, like just a list of clusters should be enough. But the idea that there's an authoritative list of clusters on, I was kind of wondering if it should be on the resource or separate, but it probably should just be on. And any sort of higher level mechanisms for determining placement can just boil down to that. It kind of provides an easy integration point for any other way of determining where things should go.
Correct. The only issue I think I just updated before the meeting I see with this is that we have discussed about different users or different access level users expressing intent, and if RBAC controlled resources are there which can mitigate that, then it is fine. Otherwise, it's sort of a conflict, and a resolution would be one resolution. So both admin user and a normal user can update the same field, which does not really solve what probably Maru you mentioned you were thinking by having RBAC based access control.
I guess my thinking is that in the near term, this is a solution that works and will just enable us to like lay the groundwork. I do think that if we want to, if we wanted to have some sort of enforceable policy thing, having it be in an object that's user maintainable is a problem. Unless we have an admission controller, which is possible, I guess. I mean, maybe at some point we can explore whether controlling access at the field level with an admission controller is preferable to having to maintain a separate resource that is administratable via RBAC. But I mean, I guess all I would say is that I don't really have a good sense of which is preferable, but both are possible. So I don't think doing this precludes securing it, which makes it different.
Yeah, I agree that both are possible to do. It would be totally possible for both flavors to be implemented, and the administrator of this API can choose which one they want to use. I don't think we have to commit to one or the other right now, and I'd encourage probably prototyping both.
So sorry, I'm just catching up here. So is the debate is between whether we put the clusters that the resource is going to be propagated into, whether we make those part of the federated resource, or whether we have them decoupled in some other scheduling outcome object. Is that essentially what we're trying to decide?
That's right. That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, I share your thoughts. I think it's possible. I have some concerns that if we choose to put them inside the object too soon, it becomes easier to, or more difficult to pull them out later. Whereas if we choose to put them outside the object to start with, and then only promote things into the primary object once we're kind of sure that we got it right, a bit like the arguments around status, I think, which we also said, well, you know, there's different kinds of statuses and we're not quite sure what we want, so let's just have a separate status object and we can decide later, you know, whether it gets bundled into the main federated object or stays out separately.
Yeah, so I agree with you, Quentin. And actually, this is making me think of something else, is that if you have it in a separate object, it's easier potentially to express information about APIs that we don't know about in advance.
I have a slightly different view. I think in the case of status, where there's some question as to what ultimately users are going to want, I think in this case, we need a list of clusters indicating which clusters this resource should go into. So to my mind, it's less about kind of prototyping different forms of what we want. I think this is the fundamental primitive of deciding on placement. How you arrive at that is completely variable, and having it outside the resource makes sense to me. The question here is a little bit different, because it's really how do we enable protection of that data? Do we do it via admission controller if it's in the resource? Do we do it via RBAC or something else? Still do it via an admission controller if it's outside the resource. So I'm not saying that like there isn't value to having it outside, just that it's a slightly different scenario.
Yeah, I can buy that argument. I think there are potential implementations where this stuff is not actually persisted anywhere and doesn't even feature in the API. For example, cases where the user isn't allowed to specify precisely which clusters they want their stuff in. They can only specify, cluster selectors, and then policy and availability and other things determine where they end up, and where that is bundled in with the, so where the scheduling and propagation might, for example, be bundled into some consolidated controller, it may well be that it doesn't explicitly expose that information. And so having it mandatorily part of the object might not be what we end up wanting in the future. So for example, today that is the case. So the controller doesn't actually explicitly persist anywhere where it decided to put the objects. It just makes an on-the-fly decision and puts them there. And if you want to find out where it put them, you can do a list. You can list where they, with the appropriate label selectors, you can find out exactly where it put them. I'm not saying it's the right way to do it, but I'm saying it is one possible way to do it. And by sticking that into the object itself, you preclude that option from being available.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with Quentin on this. It seems more conservative to me for now that we can to put the information in a separate resource, and that gives us more flexibility to experiment with different flavors of placement.
Well, I don't really think that the issue is experimenting with different flavors. It's more just maybe you want it written down, maybe you don't. But I guess I can make sense. What both of you are saying makes sense. I mean, I'm kind of like, I think having an authoritative form for placement, like just a list of clusters. When I say placement, the terms are muddy. Like, list of clusters to me is just the primitive that any placement determining mechanism would boil down to for any sort of propagation. If there was to be some sort of shared propagation mechanism.
Yeah.
I don't really care where it is. If it should be at a separate resource, that's fine.
To be clear, I totally see your side of the argument as well. And I'm not saying we won't end up with the stuff in the objects, but it doesn't feel like we know exactly what it should look like yet, or what RBAC rules should apply to it. I mean, the other thing that just came to mind actually is if you decide that you want to put a bunch of resources in the same set of clusters, again, it's kind of useful to have that outside of any one of those resources. And you can say, this is the placement decision. These are the clusters I decided to put all of these different resources into, because they all need to be together. And that would be kind of difficult and or duplicated if you ended up having to like copy that information into every one of those objects individually. I'm not saying that's, you know, the only or best implementation. I'm just saying that we would have that possibility if we kept it outside, and we would kind of preclude that possibility if we stuck it inside the objects now.
Yeah. I also have a point here that it doesn't matter we keep it inside the object or outside, but what I am looking at it is at one authoritative information which can reflect the current state of the object, or current state of where the object is placed or how it should be. Probably a controller hasn't synced or moved or transferred the object to a cluster, but this is what the controller should do. Uh, uh, it could be compared with respect to the preferences, the annotations that we use against a particular, for example, replica set object in V1 Federation. So if you update it, or anybody, for example, a controller itself updates it, or a user updates it, but it's one information or one set of information which is being updated. It could be inside the object or outside the object, but it should be one-to-one information. That's what I'm trying to state here. And it need not be just a list of clusters. It could be like the way it is specified today, like weights, using which, as you mentioned earlier, that you can actually query against the clusters, or you can yourself calculate what should be the result. So it's a deterministic system.
Yeah, I do want to point out, though, that like if you want to express some notion that's like, here are the weights across these clusters, in the schemes that we've been talking about so far, those sound to me like higher level things that program the primitives. And I think we're still at the stage now where we're trying to find what the right primitives are. So we should remember that higher level things are going to program these most likely.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar comment, and I'm not even yet convinced that the record of where an automated scheduler decided to place a set of objects need be the same as the place where we record that a user wants to put a set of objects into a specific set of clusters. I know that might sound a little bit kind of pedantic, but the kind of API that you would want to expose to a user would probably use things like cluster names and or, you know, labels on the clusters saying, you know, cluster A, cluster B, cluster C. Whereas a lower level primitive might actually use like UUIDs and have very specific internal representations, which would, you know, be suitable for consumption by a propagator, for example, but may not be suitable for expression by a user.
Yeah, I've had basically the exact same thought, Quentin.
So again, not to say that we couldn't unify those in the future if we discover that they look sufficiently similar to not warrant two separate objects, but I'm not convinced that we're kind of there yet.
Yeah, what I mean to say is like, as Paul, you mentioned that it is like two different levels of primitives. So the higher level ones can probably program the simpler ones too. So the simplest form is what I am looking at, which should be one. Or we can decide that simplest form is sort of a level above in hierarchy, rather than having just the cluster list as the simplest form. But probably the simplest form should be one, and that maybe can be programmed by rest of the higher level primitives and all. But I'm looking at one set of information which is at a given point of time probably coherent or will become coherent with rest of the system or all the other primitives.
Yeah, makes sense. Where do we think we want to put things like replica counts? I mean, presumably once a scheduler, be it a human or a piece of software, has decided to propagate something into a bunch of clusters, in many of the interesting cases, it has something like a replica count associated with it, like a specific number of replicas.
I think it's part of, it should be part of the federated object, the main resource.
Is that status, or is that the output of a scheduling decision? I mean, in either case, it seems like we've already decided that both status and the output of a scheduling decision should not be part of the object. My question is, this cluster placement thing that you have highlighted on the screen here, that is presumably the output of a scheduling decision, be that, yeah.
Or in case of the simplest system, it's simply specified by the user. It's part of the spec.
Yeah, but that, so when I said part of a scheduling decision, that might have been a human who made that scheduling decision. But I guess my point is, do we keep it that simple? So first of all, I think we've already decided that what you have highlighted at the moment is not part of the object. So in the previous discussion, we just decided to keep it outside of the object for a variety of reasons. So the second question is, do we have a very simple one like that only has cluster names and would be useful for a limited set of objects like secrets and config maps and whatever, but would not be useful for replica sets, for example, where you would have to have a specific set of replicas recorded somewhere? And do we have that in a separate object, or do we put that in this common?
I think this cluster placement only talks about placing it in a particular cluster or not. What you're talking about is replicas per cluster, which might go as part of the scheduling object.
Yeah, so we've talked about this previously as being related to the concept of overrides.
Mm-hmm.
So the override, and I think we've talked about modeling those as separate resources that would contain basically a subset of the object, and and say, when this object is in this cluster, which doesn't imply that it is necessarily in that cluster, but when this object is in this cluster, it should have these overrides applied to it.
Okay, so somewhere between the scheduling choice and the propagation, somebody decides to substitute a bunch of values into the template. That makes sense. So I'm comfortable with that, and I think, you know, quite a few of them will have replica counts, but there are a bunch of other overrides that will apply, and so maybe bundling those out. I'm tentatively nervous about having too many of these things, and maybe a generic override mechanism is the right mechanism there.
So there are two things that we are discussing about, right? So I remember this has been discussed earlier. So there is a federated version of the replica set, and that this is just like a replica set specifies the total replicas. The federated version of the replica set can specify the total replicas and leave per cluster replicas completely optional. And then the scheduler decides, or equal partitioning decides, that X number of replicas go into each cluster. And template could give a preferred number of replicas per cluster. For example, a template might give 2 replicas per replica set per cluster, something like that, right? I'm not able to exactly find it in this document that Paul updated. But am I talking sense, Paul? Am I talking something what you originally probably had written in the document?
So I think that we had initially sort of thought of all of these as potentially different resources. I do think that there is potentially a lot of value in a generic concept of what an override is. So for example, like if a generic override was more like a patch, like strategic patch that you could apply to an object, that kind of is a hedge against future API changes. So for example, you could write a strategic patch that would change the replica count without having to plumb the knowledge of like replica count as a concept into that object. That the more that we talk about that, that feels like kind of the right angle to model overrides on. Does that answer your question, Irfan?
Partly. What
Okay.
I was actually trying to point out is that there are three places replicas can be specified. So for example, if we talk about a federated replica set, we can say a federated replica set needs to have 10 replicas and no other information is specified, right, as part of federated replica set spec itself. Then we are talking about putting a template for each replica set that is per cluster replica set inside this federated replica set, right? So there also we can specify the template replicas. For example, we say 2 replicas per template replica set.
Yeah, I think there's a slight mismatch between what's in my mind and what's in your mind. I imagine federated replica set as being the template, and the the replica count on the federated replica set would be sort of the template replica count. And if you want to specify a higher level concept like total number of replicas, that would be specified by a resource that controls a scheduler that handles making sure that the total replica count converges on 50, for example, or 10 or whatever. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes. Yeah, it makes sense.
So Paul, I'm totally not in agreement with you here either, just to be clear.
Okay. Noted.
So, and I just want to make sure that you understand the context of that. So right now today, the replica count on federated replica set is the total number of replicas required. So that's one point. Are you aware of that? Does that?
Yes, I am aware of that.
Okay. And then I have some concerns about having it as like a stamp out thing. So for example, an example in front of us on the screen, replicas equals 50. I think most users are going to want to know like what they're paying for. And if you could specify something like that and not actually know how many clusters it was going to be propagated into, so you might get anywhere between 0 and 50,000, and you don't have an obvious way of figuring that out, and it might actually change over time. Given, like, say for example, your cluster selector said, I want this in every cluster, then you could have any number of replicas in total at any time. That doesn't seem like, I mean, it's technically feasible, of course. I'm just not sure that it's what anybody will want. I think most users will want to be able to limit and predict what they're buying, what they're using. Within, they might not want to specify a specific number, but they at least want to be able to place clear bounds on it. And this, the way it works today, seems like a pretty clear way of doing that. And it's consistent with, for whatever it's worth, it's consistent with things like Kubernetes, where you say, I want a replica set with 50 replicas. I don't care where you put them, but this is how many I want. I think that model is kind of useful.
Yeah, so I actually agree with a lot of what you said. And I think there's there's a balance to strike between what are primitives that we can come up with to model these things in such a way that like we allow for like partial replacement of the API resources that we create, or programming them from higher level primitives. And at the other end is probably like we have to balance that against what experientially for the user is going to make the most sense. And I will admit that when we talk about the like template override placement primitives, that it does seem like there is to some degree maybe something that would complicate things for the user because there isn't one place where they specify this stuff. So what I'm wondering is, does that mean that we need to rethink the scheme, or does it mean that we should think of providing that via another resource that programs those primitives? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying, and I think I know a reasonable potential solution
Okay.
to solve, I think, the two different classes of problems. So I think one valid use case is I want a total of 50 replicas, and I want to be able to tell you that somewhere. And another valid use case is I want 50 replicas in every cluster. I think the latter of those two is relatively uncommon, but let's leave that as, yes, it's a valid use case and we should accommodate it. It seems like if I don't care how many total replicas I get, I could just leave that out of the specification of the parent of the schedule, sorry, federated replica set. And if I wanted it in every cluster, it seems like the most logical place to put it would be in the template, because that template gets propagated to every cluster. So if I want 50 in every cluster, then I put inside my template replica count equals 50. And I don't put anything in the, what I'll call the parent object, the federated replica set. Or what I do is I use overrides, what have been called overrides, to make sure that every time it gets propagated to any cluster, the override for that cluster specifies that it must be 50. And I think either of those two solutions could be fine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm starting to think that we actually probably don't have as much of a mismatch on concepts as we may on vocabulary and
Okay.
what we have thought of the names of these resources representing. So let me say what is in my head, and let me see if this makes sense to other folks. I think that the mismatch that we have on vocabulary is that when we have, as I said a couple conversational beats ago, that like in my own mind, federated replica set is the template. And there are other resources for overrides and other resources for, or another resource for overrides. There's another resource for placement. And Quentin, I think the way you've been thinking of federated replica set is as a scheduler type resource where you provide, this is the total number of replicas that I want, and maybe you can say as part of that and spread it across these clusters, maybe with weights. But I think the mismatch is one that like we've been using the same word to refer to concepts that are at different levels. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess my confusion is when you say federated replica set is a template, it has a thing explicitly called a template inside it, and then it has stuff outside of that template. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm
Yes.
struggling too. So maybe whoever's projecting here, could you scroll up to the thing that's called a federated replica set? There we go. No, that one. Yeah, somewhere around there. No. That's the one. So we have that stuff up at the top. And part of it is called spec. Sorry. Yes, we have a spec. And part of the spec is a template.
Yeah, and as you are saying, Quinton, I was also under the impression that some fields which are relevant to federation will be part of this spec apart from the template. And this template is actually which specifies the object template which goes into each cluster. So far, I think this understanding holds.
Yeah. So I think it's worth getting to the bottom of this and coming to some common understanding. So my preference for this thing that is on the screen in front of us and is explicitly called a template is that bears a strong resemblance to what actually gets propagated into each cluster after some override process. So some information in that template gets fairly mechanically overridden by some templating mechanism or some override mechanism, and then gets propagated to the cluster. But outside of that, there is other user requirements for this thing. And one obvious potential one would be the total number of replicas. Now, that need not be in this federated replica set object. It may be somewhere else. For example, we've specified, I think, like propagation preferences or scheduling preferences or whatever, and I'm totally fine with that. And I think some of these things we might put inside this federated replica set object, but outside of the template, and others we might factor out into separate objects like scheduling preferences, etc. But I think they're two logically different things.
So I have a point here to make, especially to Paul. So Paul, what you are suggesting is, I mean, as per the document, I think that was the understanding that you wrote it with, that the total number of replicas can be specified as an addendum kind of a thing, an additional information, lack of which, for example, what we are thinking is that if only the federated API object is specified, then it should be sufficient for an implementer to ensure that some form of distribution or replication across all clusters can happen, and rest of the other, for example, placement or scheduling specifications are addendums or something which are additional to this information and which help build a more complex system. Whereas what I am thinking right now is that that particular information, which is a total number of replicas, sort of is more inherent or more important to be specified here rather than in the scheduling. So take a case.
True? Why is
Yeah, I'm trying to explain that. So take a case that it is specified in the scheduling, and in such a system where both a federated replica set and a scheduling spec is specified, whichever is the controller will stamp out the total number of replicas probably here in this spec or somewhere else, and then we'll probably need to stamp out this number also, what I am highlighting right now, right? So whatever template spec we specify originally as part of this, for example, we say 2, and the scheduling result is that this replicas per cluster should be 10. Then it needs to be stamped out in each of the those. Whereas if we specify a total number of replica here also, that is the one which is one source of information. It needn't be stamped out. And
so
this,
I have a question though, because it doesn't make sense to me why I would put, I mean, I guess I see the template as a source of information for a propagation mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily something that would require scheduling, but as soon as we get into total count, we're implying that something's doing accounting and is essentially doing scheduling. And so my assertion would be that that is something that a minimal viable, something that propagates resources across clusters, may not include a scheduler, may not actually have the ability to control a number of replicas. For some people, that might be sufficient because they have a small number of clusters and it doesn't vary dynamically, right? And if I have a higher order use case where I'm actually going to require scheduling and I'm going to have to worry about, if I add other clusters, is my replica count going to balloon because I haven't set an upper bounds on it? You're going to have a scheduler. So to me, it's
Yeah,
like they're kind of
probably.
distinct use cases and they're layerable as long as you keep the things separate. As soon as you start putting everything everywhere, it's like, well, what's responsibility? And if I'm not using a scheduler, what does this mean? To me, it gets confusing for the simpler cases. And it's kind of a balance because it's kind of like, well, if we don't put it there, then it's more complicated for the more complex use cases. But I would argue that keeping things as simple as possible is preferable.
Yeah,
So
what I
I
think.
still think, guys, I still think we have a mismatch. Let me draw a picture on the board really quick.
Okay. No, just
Sorry.
let me state one more
Sure,
point.
go ahead,
What?
Irfan.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm going to mute my video and I'll draw this picture and you go ahead and
Okay.
I'm stopping talking now.
What I am thinking at this is from the point of view of the user. So, um, from the point of view of the user, ideally, general cases or generic cases that I might be wrong. I mean, I might be corrected for that. As Quinton mentioned, that he probably or she probably wants to create a replica set in the control plane, and does not really care about rest of the clusters, where what goes. Probably the use case or the more widely used use cases, this one. If you look at it from this point of view and want to address that more prominently, then uh, I guess the point that I'm making holds more weightage. Whereas if you talk about the segregation of concerns and completely delineating the scheduling concern from the specification or the templating concern, then Maru, I think you are right about it. So we have to choose between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the general consensus we seem to have is that if we're not sure that something should go in the primary object in the federated replica set, if there's any kind of disagreement as to what it should look like or whether it should be there or how it should work, we should just, for the time being, factor it out into something else. And then people can iterate and experiment with different ways of doing that. And then maybe at some point in the future, we say this is the best way and we're going to promote this into the primary object. Is that a fair reflection of where everyone's minds are at the moment?
I'm quite fine with that.
Maru and Paul, are you?
Yeah, I think that's our general intent. I mean,
Yeah.
my vehemence
So on
is,
that basis, I would say that we have agreement that we take this aggregate number of replicas out and we put it somewhere else than in the primary object. And I'm fine with that. But if we're going to apply that principle, then I think we need to be consistent with applying that principle. And I'm just trying to think, for example, whether, so assuming that my assertion is, for the moment, is correct, that the majority use case will be will not be the case where a user decides precisely which clusters they want to put their resources in and precisely how many replicas they want in each. In that case, is the replicas field in the template, does that belong in here, given that it wouldn't be used in the use case I just described, and therefore should we lift that out as well? and I'm sort of using this as a devil's
What do you mean lift
advocate.
though? I
Say
mean,
again?
what do you mean by lift? Like the template is explicitly the type that is being federated. So there's no like, oh, we're going to remove that field. Are you just suggesting that it not be included as a matter of documented practice?
I think that sorry, Quentin, go ahead. Sorry.
No, and that might be an argument for Maru, the argument you just made, which is that the template is precisely the fields in the template are precisely defined by what a Kubernetes replica set is. So we're not even going to argue about what's in there and what's out of there. It's exactly a Kubernetes replica set. In which case, arguably that comment at the top that says there's no correlation between a version of a federated resource type and its Kubernetes equivalent is maybe not valid. That this template is like exactly a version x.y of a Kubernetes replica set.
I think there's that. I don't know. I kind of just want to delete that comment because
That's fine. Okay.
But the intention wasn't to say it's more that the version that you see at the top of, like for federated resource, the API version versus the API version here, those are not correlated.
Yeah. Okay. So let's not go on that tangent.
Yeah.
I agree with you that we, but I don't know that actually stands up to scrutiny. The idea that this template is exactly a Kubernetes replica set, because it's going to have like substitutable fields in it, I guess, for cases where your overrides take place.
Well, the point was that it's typed, not that it would necessarily represents the final form that will appear.
Can I interject quickly? So here's the mismatch that I think that we've been having. Actually, there's two parts. So one, the spec.replicas, I think should come out of this document. And that's the first part. The second part is that the primitives here are templates, overrides, and placement. And when since I have red hair at this moment, I'm going to use red marker to represent my brain. And when I've been talking about federated replica set, I'm thinking template, right? And I think Quentin and Irfan, well, I don't want to speak for everybody. I think Quentin has been describing his, I'm going to put Quentin in blue because I think you're wearing a blue shirt in your avatar on Slack. So when Quentin has been describing federated replica set, that it's this higher level thing here, and I think you could totally build a resource like this that would have the template, and it would have the total replica count, and maybe some other information like preferences or weights. And a controller watches this resource and creates these primitives. So in my mind, that means that we don't actually have, Quentin, it was white. Your shirt is white, but I don't have a white marker, so that's okay. I don't think we actually have that much of a mismatch. Do people see my point here? That like you could make as this could be a valid higher level resource that like folds this stuff together if that's a good way for a user to think about it. And there's like maybe part of this could also be what controller acts on this to realize these things. I think this is a perfectly valid scheme here, but I have thought of this as having a different name.
I'd have to digest that for a second because it's sort of the first time I've seen it presented this way. And my initial reaction is that it's kind of complicated. There is actually an explicit field inside a thing called the federated replica set right now in the proposal that is called template.
Yes.
And so I think that box on the bottom left, if it is anything other than what I just described, we should rename that box on the left. Because it just becomes confusing. Yeah, that one there. So there is a field called template inside something called federated replica set, and that is what is consistently used through Kubernetes. That is a consistent with the meaning of a template. So I think we should not override that term to mean something different.
So are you indicating that maybe this would be better called federated replica set template?
Well, I don't know what that thing on the bottom left is. I guess that's my problem. I thought it was the thing at the top left. But if it's not that, and it's not the thing that is called a template inside the spec, currently inside the spec of a federated replica set, then I don't know what it is.
I'm kind of confused by this diagram as well. Like to me, the federated replica set, its overrides and its placement, however those are represented, would be used to determine whether the resource goes into a cluster and in what form. And so the fact that it breaks those things out, it's almost like the things at the bottom, those are the primitives we need to compose.
Right.
But I don't understand what the controller is doing to create them. I kind of see them as being, again, etcd read by a controller, and then given a list of clusters, figuring out what resource to put in which clusters.
Yeah, I think my thinking is consistent with yours, Maru. Not to say that we couldn't like reformulate it, but that's always been my thinking. And I think I thought we had consensus on the fact that we had this thing called the federated replica set, and that represented, ultimately represented this thing that we wanted to propagate into possibly more than one cluster, possibly with overrides, possibly with scheduling, possibly with a whole bunch of things. But there was still logically this thing that was going to be propagated into multiple clusters, and that is a federated replica set. And then in an ideal world, if we could all come to agreement on what the status of that thing was, it would have a status inside the object. And if we could all come to agreement on what scheduling preferences looked like and how they would be implemented, it would have scheduling preferences. And if we could all come to agreement on what overrides look like and how they work, we could put those inside there as well. And in an ideal world where we had the field-based RBAC and all these other things, that would all be part of a federated replica set. And that is what is currently captured inside the annotations on the V1 of the federated replica set. Now, because we can't come to agreement, or have not yet come to agreement on what status, scheduling preferences, overrides, et cetera, look like for any given type, we've decided to pull these out into separate things. And we've created a separate API object called federated replica set scheduling preferences, or whatever it's called. And status, et cetera. But I think those are all still basically clustered around this central concept of a federated replica set.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
What is contentious, or what are we? I'm in agreement with everything, so I'm curious what we're trying to figure out.
Well, I think Paul doesn't have that idea in his head, and we need to, unless we're going to talk past each other, we need to reconcile the two different views, I think.
Yeah, so here is what I think the difference is I think the real fundamental mismatch, and I might be wrong about this, but I think the fundamental mismatch that we're talking about right now is that I have viewed, like, does everybody at least agree? We have been talking about basically this stuff so far. Yes?
No.
All right.
I think we've been talking about the thing at the top left.
Well, the thing at the top left and the, placement and overrides defined
Yeah, which
in relation to that.
we've factored the thing in the top left into a couple of different objects, but they're all clustered around the thing on the top left. And we've tentatively put the thing at the bottom left as a field of the thing in the top left, and we've called it template.
So in my own mind, all of these different things have been decomposed into separate resources, and the with the goal, and I think this is where the actual mismatch is, that in my mind, the future has been that we'll have these primitives, and if we think there's a better experience to provide combining some of them, then we can make resources that encapsulate that combined thing, but that fundamentally the primitives are there not for eventual recombination into other resources, in the sense of, like, we'll take away this resource and we'll create another resource that has X, Y, and Z resources, like their functional areas together in one resource. I have thought of it more like, we won't like get rid of this one and get rid of this one and move them into this one. I've thought of it more as, like, this might be a view that you provide, or a virtual resource, or something else where, like, a particular opinionation of how these should relate together is encapsulated. So that if I come in and I'm like, I get that there's a template here, I get that there's a total replica count, but I don't like this and I don't like that I can make my own, like, Paul replica set that has the exact stuff that I want, that differently programs these. Does that make sense? At least in terms of where the mismatch is, not whether you agree with it or not.
I think it makes a little bit more sense, but I don't think that I certainly wasn't thinking of allowing that kind of abstraction. Like, to me, it was, the model is that if you have a type you want to federate, that type sort of sits on its own. And if you want to add overrides or placement, if those happen, like the overrides, as we've described them thus far, have been type specific, maybe the path-based scheme you've talked about would remove that requirement. And maybe placement could be agnostic. But the requirement for federating something would be, I have a resource, and then I'll create a federated version that includes that as a template. And then I will either, provide an adapter into the existing SIG controller. I'll write my own controller to figure out how to treat those resources in relation to the clusters that are part of the federation. And so the idea, like, does that make sense?
Yeah, my thinking is consistent with yours, Maru. When you I've got another comment, but I'll wait until everyone's done.
So I think we still have a mismatch, though. So we talked about schedulers as things that program overrides and program placement. So how does that fit into everybody else's model?
In their special case, if you had a new type that needed to be scheduled, you'd have to implement support for that, like via scheduling preferences. You'd have to add support to a scheduler to know what to do with it, how to treat the underlying resources. Like there's there's kind of the general case where I'm talking about simple propagation and I don't need to do scheduling. I don't need to figure out, cluster specific overrides on a resource specific basis. And that can be, we can probably have code generation to cover that case. When it comes to scheduling, I don't think that there's any general purpose solution for that. At least not in my experience, like working with, replica sets, deployments, jobs, HPA, those all seem to be special cases that require special support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
So are we differing on something fundamentally, or is it just language?
I'm trying to figure that out. I'm not sure.
So,
Okay, for the time being, I'll take my explanation of that replica count back. Probably that brought in this difference. I don't know.
wait, don't wipe that off yet, Paul. I think it was a useful diagram.
I'll draw it back. Draw it back. All right.
So you had a point, Quentin?
I just want to wait for Irfan to finish if he's not finished yet.
Yeah, I was just mentioning something irrelevant.
Okay.
The other point which is relevant is that we are officially out of time. So do we want to continue? Yeah?
I've got a few more minutes if anyone else has.
I am fine
maybe
with
we
that.
should wrap up. I guess my parting comment was, I think Paul's model is one where the stuff at the bottom is kind of like fixed, and the stuff, so those boxes at the bottom, you had a template, you had a scheduling preferences, you had a, what else did you have? Overrides, etc. And then the thing on top of that, which you drew at the top right-hand corner, is the interchangeable thing. And that is, you can build higher levels on top of those primitives, but the primitives are relatively well-defined and static. My thinking, I think, was the other way around, which is that the thing at the top is kind of well-defined. Maybe not the internals of it, but the fact that you have a federated replica set is a concept, and we keep that thing as simple as we can right now. And all of the things that you drew at the bottom of the diagram, we play around with different versions of them, different versions of scheduling preferences, different versions of status, different versions of templating or overrides, etc. And then if and when we converge on one of those for any given area, we contemplate promoting it to being like the default way of doing it. But that's entirely optional. We may never get to that point, but we always have the concept of a federated replica set. And that's pretty central to the whole thing. Exactly how it's propagated and exactly how it gets scheduled. There may be different implementations of that, but you still have a thing called a federation.
I agree with both. I think I get what you were trying to get at, Paul. And maybe because we've generally seen eye to eye on this, and I was kind of confused where you were going.
Yeah, I think maybe we had some mismatch on vocabulary, and I think the big, the major mismatch is, where does the template live? Is it a separate thing? Is it part of federated replica set?
Arguably,
that seems to be the question that we're really dancing around.
My conception, like in terms of the primitives, I think having a canonical representation of overrides and a canonical representation of placement, and as we've discussed, just a list of clusters, and a canonical representation of like the base template. To me, that's kind of the core of it, whether or not it's represented in resources or not. Just having the conception. My idea is, if you had, overrides, however you implement it, just one way to do it, and placement, one way to do it, then any sort of propagation mechanism could be fed from higher level things, like schedulers, whether it be like selector-based placement or selector-based overrides, like things. It could be whatever people want, but if it was done so it all boiled down to that, then you wouldn't have to change your propagation mechanism to support some new way of defining a higher order definition of these concepts.
Right, and you could also adapt other things into that scheme by having them generate the primitives, right? And by other things, I mean like the thing that I always come back to is like templates overrides placement, and I would want to be able to easily adapt something like Helm into using these primitives by having it generate those primitives and then take advantage of the rest of the work for propagation.
Lost me on the Helm thing, but I agree with everything else.
Yeah, I also have the same question, but there would be some information needed by the Helm to generate those, right? I thought that this is the information we incrementally specify as the user or an admin or somebody. Not something which is generated by something like that.
But I mean, generated from anything. It doesn't have to be Helm. That's just an example.
Yeah, Helm is just a tool that lets you differentiate parts of resources, basically.
No, I think Maru mentioned this it correctly, like generated versus user specified. So I was assuming all this is user specified.
So I guess the only difference for me is when you talk about a template, I think a federated resource that contains like a template field, to me that kind of is the template, and I don't really see much value in varying that. Like I'm not saying someone couldn't, but to me that's kind of a base primitive that we wouldn't really change in the same way that like overrides and placement would be base primitives. So template to me is federated replica or federated whatever. It can't be type agnostic. The other two maybe can be.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And actually, Maru, if you remember a couple Federation working groups ago, we like immediately got onto chat and we're drawing stuff on the whiteboard and trying to figure out where template went. Does that ring any bells, Maru?
Maybe. Is that a diagram that you put in the document or a different one?
No, it was something I drew on the board, and we were trying to like draw the primitives and then add higher level concepts and see where they fit on the diagram. And I was trying to figure out where I thought template should actually go. Is it a primitive or is it a higher level thing? And I realize now that we're actually talking through this very question. So I think that I would be okay if template is not a distinct thing. If we want to just say that federated replica set, for example, is the template, and maybe we like can eventually fold some additional notions into that, I think that's totally fine.
I have some concerns about that because I think we're just skirting what is a fundamental kind of disagreement on things, in the sense that I think we have this notion of a federated replica set, which is, you know, the collective thing that we propagate into multiple clusters. And I don't think that is the template that is used to generate the thing into the clusters. I think those are two different things. And I don't want us to confuse. So I would rather be very explicit and actually have, and we could just as well use the Kubernetes API itself and say, you create a replica set. And you say, this is the replica set. It's got all the spec fields and everything else that a normal Kubernetes one has. And if you want to propagate something like that into more than one clusters, you can just refer to it by name. And that is your template. And then you have this other thing, which is to say, I want to propagate that thing into, you know, these clusters like this, using this policy, etc. And that's the high level thing. And if you don't want the high level thing at all, then we can save ourselves a lot of discussion or disagreement or whatever, because then people can build any number of those higher level things. And I'm fairly okay with that idea, but I don't want us to call what you are thinking of as the thing we stamp out into each cluster, as what I'm thinking of as the thing that represents the stamping out of all of those things into all of the clusters and overrides and scheduling preferences and status and all the other things. Which
doesn't the concept of federated replica set contain a template in your mind, Quentin?
I think it does, but it contains a lot more than that conceptually, and that's what I want us to be very clear on. So if in your mind it is just the template, then I'd rather just call it a template and put it in, and if you don't like it being, I mean, right now it is a field of federated replica set is called template, and that is what I believe to be the template, but I believe there's a lot of other stuff that is directly properties of a federated replica set which are not the template. And we have been moving in the direction of factoring those out into a bunch of kind of satellite objects, because we, not totally sure what they should look like, and we don't want to, all the reasons we've given. But that doesn't change the fact that this thing exists, and it is distinct from the template, which the thing that is currently explicitly called the template, which is exactly analogous to the pod template in a Kubernetes non-federated replica set.
So would it be helpful to maybe, like if we call a federated...
Sorry, Maru, I just had a thought which I hope might clarify things. If I could just say that quickly, it might help a lot. So in Kubernetes, we have a replica set, right? And it has a bunch of properties, like how many replicas, I can't remember, or maybe deployment's a better example. It has how it gets rolled out, all of those things. And inside it, it has a pod template. And the pod template specifies what the pods that it stamps out look like. And I think that's the right model. And now, if the thing you're talking about, Paul, is just the equivalent of the pod template, I think we should be very explicit that that's what it is. If the thing you're talking about is the replica set or the deployment, which is what I've been talking about all along, then that contains all of these other things like replica counts, rolling update strategies, and all of these other things. And it's totally fine to factor those out into related objects, but they still exist and they're still they're a property of the, using the Kubernetes analogy again, they're a property of the replica set. They're not a property of the pod.
So is it just levels of abstraction, like the overrides and the placement are related to the federated replica set, i.e. they're configuring things as a whole versus applying specifically to the template, like...
Exactly.
Right. I agree with that. I'm not actually sure what question you're answering, though. I mean, I totally agree with it, but was there some question
about...
What
I'm answering is that I want to make sure that we don't have something which we call a federated replica set, as in the document explicitly today, and a field inside there called a template, which we explicitly have in the document, which if you look at Kubernetes replica set or deployment, they're different things. They mean very clear things. And in my mind, they had meant very clear things in our discussions. But Paul is, I think, of the opinion that they mean the same thing.
So just conflating template with federated replica set, is that the concern?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So go ahead, Maru. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Nope, I will not go.
I guess I can see your concern. I mean, today, because of this desire to break things apart, there has been, all a federated replica set contains at the moment in the prototype I've been working on is a template. And so calling it the template is like a shorthand for the thing that carries the template. But I don't think I'm confused about the fact that a federated replica set really is a federated replica set, overrides, and placement, however those are defined. And if they're separate resources, maybe we need a catch-all term to refer to all the resources that are involved in federating that resource to the member clusters.
Yeah, so I think you and I are totally in alignment. I don't think Paul agrees with that.
So I think of this box as being a distinct thing, that maybe it's most appropriately called federated replica set template and not federated replica set, from is what I'm starting to think based on this conversation. If federated replica set is the thing that ties these things together or gives some indication of how they should be programmed by something else, that seems to make sense to me. Is that what we're talking about?
Makes sense. My concern would be that I think initially the goal is to break things apart to allow sort of experimentation. But I do take the point that at some point, if we determine that a specific form would be easier for the user and easier to maintain and easier to document, collapsing things together, I think naming it template kind of fixes it in place and says this is the template and that's all it ever is. And I think it could potentially be more, I guess. Like, to me, the overrides, for example, like it's still a puzzle in my head whether overrides should be separate or just part of the resource. Like, I'm not saying you don't have a higher level mechanism that determines overrides. Like I said, via selectors is the example that I come up with. But in terms of like what specific values specific clusters are going to get, that seems like a property of a federated replica set. But I'm not saying we need to do that immediately. I'm just saying, like, we're doing this separate, and then we'll see where it makes sense to collapse it down. We're denormalizing, and maybe it makes sense to normalize for, usability or performance or any other thing. And I just would prefer to avoid sort of fixating on its current form, I guess.
Yeah, I guess we should probably wrap up.
Yeah.
And maybe go and think about this and clarify. I guess my parting thought is that either we need to very clearly agree what the thing that is currently called a federated replica set is. And I think Maru and I agree on what that is, and I think Paul doesn't. And unless we can come to a common understanding of that, I would be more in favor of actually pulling the thing that is currently called template out of there and explicitly calling it replica set template, and having it be precisely the same schema as a Kubernetes replica set, and then we can have no confusion. And then it will never get any fields other than what is in a Kubernetes replica set, and everything else goes in this parent object, which I would propose we call federated replica set, which does all of the things that Maru just described. And then we can have no misunderstandings, I think.
I think that sounds very reasonable. If it's better to call it replica set template, that's fine. In my mind, that's kind of what the thing I've been thinking of is. And I think actually we don't really have a mismatch. We just had a mismatch on vocabulary. Because I basically agree with what everybody else has said. I do think that these primitives as distinct things are very useful, so that if someone is like, hey, I don't like something about what federated replica set is, I can build another flavor of it without reinventing all of the rest of the stack. But I have absolutely no qualms in a vacuum if we have like a high degree of consensus about what we think federated replica set looks like, that we should have that we could have an object that has those elements in one place. I have no qualms with that at all.
Cool. Let's wrap up.
Okay.
We'll see you guys. I think everyone scheduled something for Monday, so we can continue then.
Yeah, we had this chat last 2 Wednesdays if we need a meeting on Monday, and I think on both the occasions we sort of agreed that doing it more regularly is beneficial. So now forward, there'll be a meeting notice for Monday and Wednesday, I guess.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, guys. See you on Monday then.
Okay. See ya.
Bye bye.
Take care.